October 12, 1916. Craiglockhart War Hospital, Edinburgh, Scotland. Captain Wilfred Owen sat in the day room, his hands trembling as he tried to light a cigarette. The match kept slipping between his fingers. Around him, other officers stared at walls, flinched at sounds that weren't there, or walked in slow circles like men trapped in invisible cages. These were not the wounded with visible injuries. No bandages covered their heads. No crutches supported their steps. No scars marked their skin. But something in them was broken just the same. Dr. Arthur Brock watched from the doorway. He had been working with shell-shocked officers for 18 months now, and he still struggled to understand what he was witnessing. These were men who had commanded troops, made life-and-death decisions, survived artillery barrages that turned earth to liquid fire. Now they couldn't sleep without screaming. Couldn't eat without their hands shaking. Couldn't hear a door slam without diving for cover. The British Army called it shell shock, because they needed to call it something. The term suggested a physical cause, a mechanical explanation. The concussive force of high explosives had somehow damaged the nervous system. This was preferable to the alternative explanation that the war itself, the endless horror of industrial slaughter, had simply broken something fundamental in the human mind. Down in the hospital gardens, Lieutenant Siegfried Sassoon walked alone. He had been sent to Craiglockhart not because he was broken, but because he had declared the war itself insane. His public statement against the continuation of the conflict had embarrassed the War Office. They had three options: court-martial him for insubordination, imprison him as a traitor, or declare him mentally unfit and send him for treatment. They chose the third option because Sassoon was a decorated war hero whose courage under fire was beyond question. But the other men at Craiglockhart, the ones who hadn't written anti-war manifestos, they were here because something had happened to them in the trenches. Something that couldn't be explained in medical terms or military language. They had seen things that human beings were never meant to see. Done things that human conscience was never designed to accommodate. And now they were paying a price that had no name. The British public didn't want to hear about shell shock. The newspapers rarely mentioned it. When they did, the tone was often skeptical. Real soldiers, the articles implied, didn't break down. Real men pushed through discomfort and did their duty. This psychological collapse was either malingering or moral weakness or insufficient patriotic spirit. The War Office struggled with the same question. How could men who seemed physically healthy be unable to return to duty? The financial cost of caring for thousands of mentally disabled officers and enlisted men was staggering. But more troubling was what it suggested about the nature of modern war. If industrial combat could destroy minds as efficiently as it destroyed bodies, what did that mean about the entire enterprise? Some military doctors took a harder line. They administered electric shock treatments to men who couldn't stop trembling, believing they could literally jolt soldiers back to functionality. They used Seamus therapy, suggesting that shell-shocked officers were letting down their comrades by their weakness. Some doctors openly stated that the condition was simply cowardice given a medical label. But other doctors, men like Brock and W.H.R. Rivers who worked at Craiglockhart, took a different approach. They listened to their patients. They took seriously the nightmares, the tremors, the inability to concentrate. They recognized that these men were suffering from genuine wounds, even if those wounds didn't show on X-rays or respond to surgery. And as these doctors listened, they began to notice something unusual. The soldiers who seemed to cope best, who maintained some semblance of mental resilience despite everything they'd experienced, were the ones who had developed certain specific behaviors in the trenches. Ways of talking about death. Small rituals performed before battle. A particular kind of humor that made jokes out of horrors. These coping mechanisms weren't conscious therapeutic strategies. The soldiers hadn't read psychology textbooks or attended workshops on stress management. These behaviors had emerged organically from the conditions of trench warfare itself. Men who spent months living in mud, surrounded by corpses, under constant threat of sudden obliteration had created their own informal methods for staying sane. Or at least, for delaying the moment when sanity finally collapsed. The doctors at Craiglockhart began documenting these patterns. They interviewed soldiers about life in the trenches, not just about combat experiences but about the daily routines, the jokes, the superstitions, the small habits that structured existence between battles. What they discovered was an entire subculture of psychological survival techniques that had evolved independently of military command or medical oversight. Private Thomas Atkins had been in France since September 1914. He'd survived the First Battle of Ypres when most of his battalion was wiped out. He'd been at Loos, the Somme, and Passchendaele. By rights he should have been a gibbering wreck. But when interviewed at a casualty clearing station after taking shrapnel to his shoulder, Atkins seemed remarkably composed. Asked how he'd managed to endure so much combat without breaking down, Atkins thought for a moment then said, "You learn not to think about tomorrow. And you learn to laugh at things that aren't funny. And you have your little rituals. Touch your lucky coin before you go over the top. Check your equipment in the same order every time. These things, they give you something to hold on to. Make you feel like you've got some control even when you know you haven't. It was this observation, repeated by hundreds of soldiers in different words, that began to interest military psychologists. Perhaps the key to understanding shell shock wasn't just studying the men who broke down. Perhaps it was studying the men who didn't break down, or who broke down less quickly. What were they doing differently? What informal psychological technologies had they developed? The British Army in World War I numbered millions of men. Most of them experienced genuine combat trauma. Most witnessed horrors that would haunt them for decades. But not all of them collapsed into dysfunction. Some maintained operational effectiveness month after month, year after year, despite conditions that should have destroyed anyone's sanity. These were the survivors. Not the ones who were physically lucky enough to avoid bullets and shells, but the ones who were psychologically resilient enough to absorb the trauma without shattering. And the question that began to fascinate military doctors was simple but profound. What was their secret? November 3, 1916. Trench system near Thiepval, Somme sector. Corporal Albert Richards sat on a firestep, writing a letter home by the light of a guttering candle. Around him, other men of B Company were settling into another night in the front-line trench. Some cleaned rifles. Some played cards. Some just stared at the mud walls, smoking cigarettes and thinking about nothing in particular. Above them, star shells burst periodically, flooding no man's land with harsh magnesium light. In the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder that never quite ended. Occasionally a machine gun would chatter briefly, then fall silent. This was a quiet night by Somme standards. Private Billy Henderson, the company comedian, was holding court near the dugout entrance. "So there I was," he was saying, "in the latrine, right? And Jerry starts shelling. Well, I'm in a delicate situation if you catch my meaning. Can't just run for it. So I'm sitting there, business half finished, and the shells are getting closer. Boom, boom, boom." The men around him were grinning already, knowing where this was going. And I'm thinking, wouldn't that be a hell of a way to die? Caught with your trousers down, literally. What would they write to me, Mum? "Dear Mrs. Henderson, we regret to inform you that your son died heroically while taking a shit in a trench latrine." Not exactly the glorious death she's hoping for, is it? The men burst out laughing. The sound carried down the trench, drawing curious looks from soldiers who weren't close enough to hear the joke. Sergeant Davies, a veteran of 3 years' service, shook his head but was smiling despite himself. "You're a sick bastard, Henderson. You know that. That's why you love me, Sarge." This exchange, replicated thousands of times across the Western Front, represented something that civilian observers back in Britain would have found deeply troubling. These men were laughing. Not occasionally, not at appropriate moments of relief, but constantly. They made jokes about death, about dismemberment, about the rotting corpses that lay just beyond the wire. They created nicknames for artillery shells based on the sounds they made. They named rats after unpopular officers. They sang cheerfully obscene songs about the war. To someone observing from a distance, this might have seemed like callousness or emotional numbing. But it was neither. It was a highly sophisticated psychological defense mechanism that allowed men to process unbearable horror by transforming it into something they could control through language and laughter. The humor was never kind. It was savage, bitter, and absolutely merciless. When men died, their comrades would immediately make jokes about how they died, where the bullet had hit, what their last words had been. This wasn't disrespect. It was a ritual of incorporation. By turning death into a joke, they were symbolically declaring that death had no power over them. They could look directly at it and laugh. Private Henderson's latrine joke was a perfect example. He'd taken a moment of genuine vulnerability and transformed it into comedy. The fear of dying in an unheroic manner while performing a basic bodily function was real. Every soldier in that trench had experienced the same fear at some point. But by making it into a joke, Henderson had done two things simultaneously. He'd acknowledged the fear, validating it as a real concern. And he'd diffused it by making everyone laugh. This kind of humor served multiple psychological functions. First, it created group cohesion. Shared laughter bonds people together. When the entire squad laughed at Henderson's joke, they were reinforcing their identity as a unit, as men who could face death together and still find reasons to laugh. This cohesion was crucial for combat effectiveness. Soldiers fight primarily for their immediate comrades, not for abstract causes or distant commanders. Second, the humor provided emotional release. Men living under constant threat of death needed some way to discharge the accumulated stress and fear. Physical violence wasn't an option. You couldn't just start punching people. Alcohol helped, when available, but there were limits to how drunk you could get in a combat zone. Humor was safer. It let men express terror, rage, and despair in a socially acceptable format. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the humor created a sense of psychological control. The war itself was utterly beyond the control of individual soldiers. They couldn't choose when to attack, where to defend, or whether tomorrow would bring a quiet day or a catastrophic bombardment. But they could choose how to talk about the war. They could create narratives, jokes, and songs that reframed their experience in terms that made sense to them. Lieutenant Geoffrey Tilliard kept a diary throughout his service on the Western Front. Unlike official war diaries that recorded troop movements and casualties, Tilliard's diary captured the actual texture of daily life in the trenches. One entry from December 1916 noted, "Henderson told another of his revolting jokes today. The men roared with laughter. I found myself laughing too despite myself. There's something deeply wrong about finding humor in such circumstances. But I've come to believe that without this laughter, we'd all go mad within a week." The British Army had a long tradition of soldier humor. Wellington's army had joked about death in the Napoleonic Wars. The men who fought in the Crimea had their own dark comedy. But the industrial scale of World War I created humor that was darker and more pervasive than anything previous generations had developed. The sheer volume of death, the grinding permanence of trench warfare, the complete disconnect between the war's stated purposes and its actual reality, all of this demanded new forms of psychological coping. The jokes evolved as the war continued. Early in 1914, there had been a certain innocence to soldier humor. Men joked about the inconveniences of army life, about strict officers and bad food. By 1916 that innocence was gone. The jokes were about corpses, about rats feeding on dead men, about the likelihood of one's own death, about what it felt like to be blown apart by a shell. Some of the songs that emerged from the trenches became famous after the war, though usually in sanitized versions. Mademoiselle from Armentières was sung to a jaunty tune, but the original lyrics were spectacularly obscene, describing sexual encounters with a frankness that would have shocked civilian society. The Bells of Hell Go Ting-a-ling-a-ling was a cheery ditty about death and damnation. These songs served the same function as the jokes. They allowed men to articulate unbearable truths in a form that made them psychologically tolerable. Chaplain Jeffrey Studdert Kennedy, known to soldiers as Woodbine Willie, because he distributed cigarettes along with spiritual comfort, observed this phenomenon with fascination. He wrote to a colleague, "At first I was horrified by the way these men joke about death and suffering. It seemed to me a kind of spiritual degradation. But I've come to see it differently. Their humor isn't a rejection of the sacred. It's a way of preserving their humanity in circumstances that deny all humanity. They laugh because the alternative is to become either completely numb or completely mad." The humor wasn't universal or constant. There were limits. Men didn't joke immediately after a friend's death, there was a period of genuine mourning. They didn't joke about certain specific horrors, the line moved depending on individual and unit sensibilities. And the humor existed alongside genuine fear, genuine sorrow and genuine rage. It wasn't that the men felt nothing. It was that they'd learned to feel multiple contradictory emotions simultaneously, and humor was one of the tools that made this emotional complexity manageable. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this dark humor was how it differentiated between those who were in and those who were out. The jokes made sense only to men who had experienced combat. Civilians back home couldn't understand them. Staff officers at headquarters who visited the front lines briefly but didn't live in the trenches, couldn't fully appreciate them. Even soldiers in reserve areas or rear echelon positions were somewhat excluded from the innermost circle of the humor. This created an unspoken hierarchy. The men who had truly been there, who had endured the worst of trench warfare and developed the darkest sense of humor, they recognized each other instantly. A shared joke, a knowing laugh at something that would horrify outsiders, this was proof of membership in an exclusive brotherhood. The brotherhood of men who had looked into the abyss and learned to laugh at it. Corporal Richards finished his letter home, carefully avoiding any description of actual conditions. He wrote about the weather, asked about family, expressed hopes of leave. He didn't mention Henderson's latrine joke or the way the entire section had laughed at it. His mother wouldn't understand. How could she? She lived in a world where death was solemn and suffering was tragic. She had no framework for understanding men who joked about being blown to pieces. Richards sealed the letter, addressed it, and handed it to the runner who would take it back to the postal section. Then he pulled out a photograph of his wife and daughter, looked at it for a long moment and carefully tucked it back into his breast pocket. Over his heart. Where he believed it might somehow protect him. Which was, of course, ridiculous. But he did it anyway. Every day. Always the same pocket. Always the same gentle pat afterward to make sure it was secure. Even a man who joked about death still needed his rituals. January 14, 1917. Forward Observation Post, Arras Sector. Second Lieutenant James Archer performed his morning ritual with the same careful precision he'd followed for 11 months. First, he touched the smooth pebble in his left tunic pocket, the one he'd picked up from a beach in Sussex the day before shipping out to France. Then he checked his revolver, ensuring the safety was off, the chamber loaded, and the action smooth. Then he read exactly 3 lines from the letter his fiancée had sent him 4 months ago, always the same 3 lines from the middle of page 2. Then he put on his helmet, adjusting the chinstrap to exactly the same tightness. Then, and only then, was he ready to face whatever the day might bring. His Batman, Private Collins, had observed this routine countless times. He never commented on it, never asked about its significance. Collins had his own rituals. Before every patrol he tied his left boot before his right. He smoked exactly half a cigarette, then crushed it out and put the rest in his pocket. He said a specific prayer, not to God but to his dead brother who had been killed at Gallipoli, asking the brother to watch over him. These actions made no logical sense. Collins knew that. But logic had very little to do with survival in this war. The British Army in 1917 was honeycombed with superstitions and private rituals. Every unit had men who believed their survival depended on carrying certain objects, following certain routines, or avoiding certain behaviors. Some of these beliefs were shared by entire companies. Others were intensely personal, known only to the soldier who practiced them. What unified these behaviors was their function as psychological anchors. In an environment of absolute chaos where death arrived randomly and without warning, rituals created the illusion of control. A soldier couldn't control whether German artillery would target his section of trench. He couldn't control whether a sniper's bullet would find him when he looked over the parapet. But he could control whether he touched his lucky charm before going over the top. He could control the exact order in which he prepared his equipment. And this tiny island of control, utterly meaningless in objective terms, provided a psychological foundation that allowed men to function despite their fear. The rituals took countless forms. Some were about objects. Lucky coins, photographs, letters from home, religious medals, specific weapons that had supposedly kept a man safe before. These items were treasured with an intensity that would have seemed irrational to civilian observers. Men who had lost every other possession, who lived in mud and lice and filth, would guard their lucky charm with desperate possessiveness. Sergeant William Pratt carried a stuffed rabbit that his daughter had given him. The rabbit was filthy, partially dismembered, and had been repaired multiple times with whatever materials were available. Pratt was a hard man, a pre-war regular soldier who had fought in the Boer War, and he looked ridiculous carrying this children's toy into combat. But he carried it anyway. Always in the same pocket. Always touched before any action. He believed absolutely that the rabbit kept him alive. When Pratt was wounded by shrapnel in March 1917 and evacuated to a casualty clearing station, he insisted that the rabbit come with him. The medical orderlies who had seen much stranger things, made sure it did. 3 weeks later, when Pratt returned to his unit, one of the first things he asked was whether anyone had touched his rabbit while he was gone. They hadn't. Everyone in the section knew better. Other rituals were about actions. The order in which equipment was put on. The number of times a rifle bolt was checked. Specific words spoken before battle. These routines had to be performed exactly right. If a soldier was interrupted in the middle of his ritual, he would often start over from the beginning, no matter how urgent the situation. Lieutenant Colonel Owen Creighton noticed this behavior among his men and initially tried to discourage it. He believed that encouraging superstition undermined military discipline and rational thinking. But after observing his battalion for several months, Creighton changed his mind. The men who had developed these rituals seemed to perform better under stress than those who hadn't. They were calmer before attacks, more focused during combat, less likely to panic when things went wrong. Creighton eventually developed his own ritual. Before any major operation he would smoke exactly 3 cigarettes while walking the perimeter of his command post, always in a clockwise direction. He knew it was irrational. He knew cigarettes had no magical properties and walking in circles didn't influence the outcome of battles. But he did it anyway because it helped him manage his own fear and project confidence to his men. Some rituals were collective rather than individual. Entire units developed superstitious behaviors that everyone was expected to follow. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, had a tradition of touching a specific stone near their billet before going into the line. The 1st Battalion, Essex Regiment, wouldn't allow anyone to whistle while in the front-line trenches, believing it brought bad luck. The 7th Battalion, Somerset Light Infantry, always sang the same body song before an attack, and any man who didn't join in was considered to be inviting disaster. These group rituals served the same function as the dark humor. They reinforced unit cohesion and created shared identity. When everyone in the battalion followed the same superstitious practice, it created a sense of collective fate. We're all in this together. We all follow the same rules. If these rituals keep us safe, they keep us all safe. Religious observance was perhaps the most obvious form of ritualistic behavior, though it often took unusual forms. Traditional Christian faith was complicated for men in the trenches. The wholesale slaughter seemed difficult to reconcile with a loving God. Many soldiers lost whatever religious faith they'd had before the war. But others clung to it desperately, or developed highly personal religious practices that bore little resemblance to conventional Christianity. Prayers before battle were nearly universal, even among men who claimed no religious faith. But these prayers were often quite specific and contractual in nature. Not, "Thy will be done," but, "Keep me safe today and I'll go to church when I get home." Not abstract petitions for divine mercy but highly specific deals offered to God or the saints or the Virgin Mary. Corporal Patrick O'Brien, a Catholic from Dublin, had survived 2 years on the Western Front. He attributed his survival to the rosary his mother had given him and to a specific arrangement he believed he had with God. O'Brien had promised that if he survived the war, he would make a pilgrimage to Rome and become a priest. He was completely serious about this promise and believed that God was actively keeping him alive so that he could fulfill his vow. Other men in his platoon who knew about the promise treated it with complete respect. O'Brien's deal with God was his business, and if it kept him functional under fire, that was good enough for everyone. But some men went further, developing elaborate magical thinking that bordered on the pathological. They believed that specific prayers had to be recited a precise number of times. That religious medals had to be positioned in exact locations on their body. That God would protect them only if they performed certain actions in a rigidly specified order. Captain Raymond Shaw, a medical officer, noted this phenomenon with concern. Some of the men seemed to be using ritual and superstition as a substitute for realistic assessment of danger. They took unnecessary risks because they believed their lucky charm or their prayer would protect them. Shaw documented several cases of soldiers killed because they exposed themselves to enemy fire while performing some superstitious action that they believed made them invulnerable. But even Shaw had to admit that most of the time, the rituals seemed to help more than they hurt. Men who had psychological anchors, even irrational ones, were better able to function under stress. They had lower rates of breakdown and collapse. They maintained unit cohesion better. And in a war where psychological endurance was as important as physical courage, these benefits couldn't be dismissed. The rituals also created temporal structure in an environment where normal time had ceased to exist. In the trenches there was no meaningful distinction between day and night. Combat could erupt at any hour. Sleep was fragmented and irregular. Meals happened whenever food was available. The normal rhythms of human life, rhythms that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, were completely disrupted. But rituals created artificial structure. Morning routines, pre-battle preparations, evening habits. These personal ceremonies divided time into manageable segments. They created predictability in an unpredictable world. A soldier might not know whether he'd be alive tomorrow. But he knew that if he was alive, he'd touch his lucky coin in the same way he'd touched it every day for the past year. Lieutenant Archer finished his morning ritual and checked his watch. 6:47 a.m. Time for stand to, when every man in the trench would be alert and ready for a possible dawn attack. This was one of the few military rituals that actually made tactical sense. Dawn and dusk were the most likely times for enemy action. But even this official military procedure had become layered with personal superstitions. Men would stand in specific positions, hold their rifles in specific ways, think specific thoughts. As the sky lightened, Archer surveyed the men of his platoon. 32 soldiers, each one maintaining his own private relationship with fate. Each one believing, or hoping, or pretending to believe that his rituals gave him some measure of control over his survival. Were they right? Objectively, obviously not. A German shell didn't care whether you carried a lucky rabbit or touched a pepstone every morning. But subjectively, psychologically, in terms of maintaining mental coherence and operational effectiveness under unbearable stress, maybe the rituals worked exactly as intended. They didn't actually protect anyone from bullets and shells. But they protected minds from disintegration. And in a war where mental breakdown could spread through a unit like disease, that protection was worth something after all. April 21, 1917. Casualty Clearing Station, Arras Sector. Captain David Morrison sat in the corner of the medical tent, his hands covering his face, his body shaking with sobs that wouldn't stop. 3 hours ago, he'd been a competent infantry officer leading his company in an attack on German positions. Now he couldn't stand without help. Couldn't speak without stuttering. Couldn't stop crying. The medical officers who examined him found no physical injuries. No wounds. No concussion. No apparent reason for his collapse. But Morrison's mind had simply given out, like an overstressed cable snapping under load. Whatever psychological defenses he'd constructed to cope with the war had failed catastrophically and simultaneously. Morrison wasn't alone. The tent held 23 other men in similar states. Some trembled uncontrollably. Some stared at nothing with unseeing eyes. Some whispered to themselves in continuous streams of disconnected words. These were the shell-shock cases, the men whose minds had broken under stress that human consciousness was never designed to endure. What struck the medical staff most forcefully was that these men had all been functioning effectively until very recently. Many had survived months or even years of combat. They'd developed the dark humor, the rituals, the psychological defenses that had allowed them to keep operating despite everything. And then, suddenly, those defenses had failed. The humor didn't work anymore. The rituals lost their protective power. And without those psychological scaffolding, the accumulated trauma came crashing down all at once. Lance Corporal Stephen Hughes had survived the Somme offensive without a scratch. He'd been known in his battalion as one of the luckiest men alive. He'd been blown out of trenches by shellfire 3 separate times and walked away without serious injury. He carried a coin from his hometown that he believed protected him, and his survival seemed to confirm that belief. Then in March 1917, during a routine patrol, a shell landed nearby and killed 2 men in his section. Hughes wasn't hurt. But his lucky coin, which he always kept in his breast pocket, was knocked out by the blast and lost in the mud. Hughes spent 3 hours searching for it in no man's land, ignoring the risk from snipers and shells. He never found it. Without the coin, Hughes began to unravel. He developed a tremor in his hands. He couldn't sleep. He became convinced that without his coin he would certainly be killed. His section mates tried to help. One man even offered Hughes his own lucky charm, but it didn't work. Hughes's entire psychological defense system had been built around that specific coin. Without it, he had no framework for managing his fear. 3 weeks later, Hughes broke down completely during a German artillery barrage. He curled into a ball at the bottom of the trench and wouldn't move. When his sergeant tried to help him up, Hughes fought back with surprising strength, screaming that they were trying to make him go where he'd be killed. It took 4 men to restrain him. He was evacuated to a casualty clearing station diagnosed with severe shell shock. The pattern repeated across the British Army. Men who had seemed psychologically resilient suddenly collapsed. And when doctors interviewed these breakdown cases, a common thread emerged. Many of them had been using humor and ritual as their primary coping mechanisms. When those mechanisms failed, they had nothing else to fall back on. Private Robert Jenkins had been the company comedian, always ready with a joke or a funny song. His humor had made him popular and had helped maintain morale in his unit. But in February 1917, Jenkins witnessed something that his humor couldn't transform into comedy. A shell landed directly in a dugout where 3 of his closest friends were sleeping. The explosion killed them instantly, but Jenkins had to help recover what remained of the bodies. After that, Jenkins stopped making jokes. His friends tried to encourage him, tried to get him to resume his role as the company comedian, but Jenkins couldn't do it. The humor that had been his primary psychological defense simply didn't work anymore. He could see the death and horror, but he couldn't transform them into something laughable. And without that ability, the accumulated trauma of 2 years at the front overwhelmed him within days. Captain Thomas Ashworth had been a model officer. Brave, competent, respected by his men. He developed an elaborate pre-battle ritual that involved checking his equipment in a specific order, reading from a small book of poetry, and reciting a prayer that his mother had taught him as a child. This ritual had sustained him through a dozen major battles. In April 1917, Ashworth's battalion was ordered to attack at dawn. But German artillery began shelling their assembly trenches before Ashworth could complete his ritual. He tried several times to start the ritual over, but each time he was interrupted by exploding shells or urgent orders from his battalion commander. Finally, with no time left, he had to lead his men forward without having completed his ritual. The attack was successful. Ashworth performed his duties effectively. His company captured their objectives with acceptable casualties. But something in Ashworth had broken. He believed absolutely that he should have been killed in that attack because he hadn't completed his ritual. The fact that he'd survived despite breaking his routine somehow made everything worse. It meant that his entire psychological structure, everything he'd built to manage his fear, was fundamentally invalid. That night, Ashworth tried to shoot himself. His Batman interrupted the suicide attempt and wrestled the pistol away. Ashworth was evacuated with a diagnosis of shell shock and severe depression. These breakdowns revealed something crucial about the psychological coping mechanism soldiers had developed. They worked remarkably well under certain conditions, providing a framework for processing trauma and maintaining function. But they were also fragile. They depended on consistency, predictability, and the soldiers' belief in their efficacy. When any of those elements failed, the entire structure could collapse suddenly and completely. The military psychologists studying these cases began to understand that dark humor and protective rituals weren't actually eliminating trauma. They were postponing it. Soldiers were still experiencing the horror, still accumulating psychological damage. The humor and rituals just created a buffer, allowing men to continue functioning despite that damage. But the trauma didn't disappear. It accumulated. And eventually the buffer failed. Dr. Charles Myers, who had coined the term shell shock, and was now working to understand it, interviewed dozens of breakdown cases. He noted that almost all of them described the same sensation. A sudden loss of control, a feeling that whatever had been holding them together had suddenly let go. Men described it as a dam breaking, a rope snapping, a wall collapsing. All metaphors for the same experience, the catastrophic failure of psychological defenses. But Myers also observed something else. The men who had developed elaborate humor and rituals seemed to break down in specific ways. Their collapse was sudden and total, but it was also, paradoxically, more treatable. These men hadn't numbed themselves to experience. They hadn't become emotionally dead. They just overloaded their coping mechanisms. With rest and support, many of them could recover at least partially. The men who broke down worst were often those who had tried to suppress their fear entirely, who had used no humor or rituals but had simply relied on willpower and discipline to get through. These men accumulated trauma in a more direct, less processed way. When they broke, they often broke completely and permanently. Lieutenant Archer sat with Captain Morrison in the medical tent, trying to offer what comfort he could. Morrison had been in Archer's battalion. They'd known each other for 18 months. Archer had watched Morrison develop his own rituals, had seen him joke grimly about death and dismemberment like everyone else. He'd seemed fine. But Morrison had been at the front for 26 months without significant leave. He'd participated in 37 separate attacks. He'd seen 80% of his original company killed or wounded and replaced multiple times. The accumulated strain had simply exceeded what any psychological defense system could manage. Morrison kept repeating the same phrase through his sobs. "I can't do it anymore. I can't do it anymore." Archer didn't know what to say. The terrible truth was that Morrison was right. He couldn't do it anymore. His mind had broken. Whether it would ever heal was uncertain. As Archer left the medical tent, he touched the pebble in his own pocket. His morning ritual. His anchor. His small island of control in an ocean of chaos. And for the first time in 11 months, he wondered whether his ritual was protecting him or just postponing his own inevitable breakdown. Whether the humor and the routines were genuine coping mechanisms or just elaborate ways of lying to himself about the unbearable reality of his situation. He didn't know. And not knowing was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. November 11, 1918. 11 a.m. Near Mons, Belgium. The guns fell silent. After 4 years of continuous thunder, the artillery stopped. The machine guns went quiet. Along the Western Front, men climbed out of their trenches and stood upright for the first time in months, no longer hunched against possible sniper fire. The war was over. Sergeant William Pratt touched the stuffed rabbit in his pocket. Then touched it again. Then a third time. His ritual. Even though the war had ended. Even though there were no more shells to fear, no more attacks to survive. He touched the rabbit anyway because not touching it felt wrong. Felt dangerous. Even though the danger had ended. Lance Corporal Albert Richards heard someone tell a joke about an officer's incompetence. 6 months ago he would have laughed. Now he just stared. The joke didn't seem funny anymore. Or maybe it was funny, he couldn't quite tell. His sense of humor felt broken, dislocated, like a bone that hadn't healed properly. Lieutenant James Archer tried to feel something about the armistice. Relief, joy, gratitude. But he felt mainly numb. He checked his equipment in the same order he'd been checking it for 2 years, even though he wouldn't need to fight again. He read the same 3 lines from his fiancée's letter, even though she'd sent him 20 letters since that one. He touched his pebble. Always the left pocket. Always the same smooth stone. The British Army began the long process of demobilization. Millions of men, most of whom had been soldiers for years, had to somehow transform back into civilians. They had to go home to families who hadn't changed while they'd been gone, except that everything had changed, including themselves. What they brought home with them was complicated. The visible wounds, the scars and missing limbs, those were obvious. The invisible wounds, the psychological trauma, those were less clear. But what people noticed most was how these men had changed in small ways. The dark humor that didn't make sense to civilians. The rituals and habits that served no apparent purpose. The way they flinched at loud noises. The way they couldn't stop scanning their surroundings for threats. The way they seemed to be always waiting for something terrible to happen. Private Billy Henderson, the company comedian who had made jokes about dying in latrines, went home to his wife and young son. He tried to be cheerful. He tried to joke about his war experiences the way he joked with the men in the trenches. But his wife didn't laugh. She looked at him with confusion and concern, and then gently suggested that maybe he shouldn't talk about the war like that. Henderson stopped talking about the war at all. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd wake at night from nightmares, his wife shaking him awake because he was shouting in his sleep. He'd sit at dinner and suddenly be somewhere else, back in France, back in the mud, back among the men who had understood his jokes because they'd needed the same dark humor to survive. Corporal Patrick O'Brien kept his promise to God. He enrolled in seminary, working toward the priesthood he'd vowed to pursue if he survived. But his faith had changed in ways he couldn't articulate. He'd prayed for his survival and he'd survived, which suggested God had been listening. But he'd also prayed for the survival of dozens of friends who had died horribly, which suggested God either hadn't been listening or had chosen not to intervene. O'Brien no longer understood what prayer actually did or how God actually worked, but he went through the rituals anyway because he'd promised. Lieutenant Archer married his fiancée in the spring of 1919. He tried to be a good husband. He got a job in his father's business. He attempted to rebuild a normal civilian life. But he couldn't stop his morning ritual. Every day he touched the pebble. Checked his equipment. Though he no longer had military equipment, he checked his wallet, his keys, his watch in the same order. Read 3 lines from his wife's letters, always the same 3 lines from the same letter. Put on his hat, adjusting it to exactly the same position. His wife noticed these behaviors but didn't comment. She'd been warned that soldiers came back changed. She tried to be patient and understanding. But she couldn't understand, why her husband performed these small inexplicable actions with such desperate consistency. What the British public discovered in 1919 and 1920 was that bringing the army home didn't end the war's psychological impact. Hundreds of thousands of men struggled to readjust to civilian life. Some couldn't hold jobs because they were too nervous or irritable. Some drank heavily, trying to silence memories that wouldn't quiet. Some simply withdrew, becoming isolated and uncommunicative. The government hadn't prepared for this. There were hospitals for physically wounded soldiers, but very few resources for men with psychological injuries. Shell shock was still poorly understood and often stigmatized. Men who broke down after coming home were sometimes accused of malingering or trying to claim undeserved pensions. But the veterans themselves began to recognize patterns. When they gathered at British Legion halls or regimental associations, they found they shared more than memories of combat. They shared habits, rituals, ways of talking and joking that made sense only to other veterans. The dark humor that had sustained them in the trenches became a marker of shared experience, a way of identifying who had been there and who hadn't. Sergeant Davies, who had survived 3 years at the front, found himself unable to explain to his civilian friends why he still followed certain routines. He still tied his left boot before his right. Still checked doors twice to make sure they were locked. Still carried certain objects in specific pockets. These habits made no sense in peacetime London. But abandoning them felt impossible, like removing a load-bearing wall from a building. The physicians who'd worked with shell-shock patients during the war continued studying these men afterward. Dr. Brock and Dr. Rivers published papers describing what they'd observed. They documented how humor and ritual had helped men survive psychologically during combat. They also documented how those same coping mechanisms sometimes became maladaptive in peacetime, preventing men from fully readjusting to civilian life. The research revealed something important. The psychological tools that allowed men to function in an abnormal environment, industrial warfare, could actually impair function in a normal environment, peacetime society. Humor that was adaptive when surrounded by death became inappropriate when surrounded by ordinary life. Rituals that created psychological stability in chaos became obsessive-compulsive behaviors when the chaos ended. Some veterans found ways to integrate their war experience into their peacetime identity. They joined veterans organizations where they could be around other men who understood. They used their dark humor selectively among people who got the jokes. They quietly maintained their rituals without drawing attention to them. But many struggled. The divorce rate among returning soldiers was high. Employment problems were common. Rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide were elevated among veterans compared to men who hadn't served. The psychological cost of the war extended far beyond the armistice, rippling through British society for decades. Captain Morrison, who had broken down at the casualty clearing station in 1917, spent 3 years in psychiatric hospitals. He was eventually released as improved, though not cured. He attempted to resume normal life but found it nearly impossible. He couldn't work regularly. His relationships with family members were strained. He lived on a small military pension and the charity of relatives until he died in 1934, at age 41, essentially broken by experiences he'd had 17 years earlier. But Morrison's case, tragic as it was, represented something important about the nature of psychological trauma and coping mechanisms. The humor and rituals that British soldiers developed weren't perfect solutions. They didn't prevent trauma. They didn't eliminate psychological damage. But they did allow men to continue functioning in circumstances that should have destroyed anyone's sanity. The legacy of these coping mechanisms extended beyond World War I. Military psychologists studying World War II noted similar patterns. American soldiers in Vietnam developed their own dark humor and protective rituals. Every subsequent conflict has produced similar behaviors, soldiers creating informal psychological defenses to manage unbearable stress. Modern military psychology has studied these phenomena extensively. The technical terms have changed. Shell shock became combat fatigue, became post-traumatic stress disorder. The understanding has deepened. But the basic truth remains. Humans exposed to prolonged extreme stress develop informal coping mechanisms, and these mechanisms are often crucial for maintaining psychological function. The dark humor of British soldiers in World War I, which shocked and disturbed civilian observers, is now recognized as a valuable psychological tool. Military psychologists actively encourage soldiers to develop humor as a coping strategy. The understanding is that humor doesn't eliminate trauma, but it helps process it, makes it more manageable, creates social bonds that provide additional psychological support. Similarly, the rituals and superstitions that seemed irrational to observers are now understood as adaptive responses to environments of radical uncertainty. When external control is impossible, internal rituals provide a sense of agency and predictability. Modern military training actually incorporates ritual and routine as tools for managing stress and maintaining discipline. But the post-war struggles of World War I veterans also revealed limits to these coping mechanisms. The transition from combat to peacetime remains difficult, even with better psychological understanding and support systems. Veterans still struggle with readjustment. The humor that worked in combat still alienates civilians. The rituals that provided stability in war still seem strange or excessive in peace. Lieutenant Archer lived a long life. He had children and grandchildren. He had a successful business career. By most measures he readjusted well to civilian life. But until the day he died in 1967 at age 74, he still performed his morning ritual. Touch the pebble in his left pocket. Check his possessions in specific order. Read 3 lines from a letter. Adjust his hat. Every morning. For 50 years after the war ended. His grandchildren knew grandfather had some odd habits, but they didn't know where those habits came from. They didn't know about the trenches, about the fear, about the desperate need to maintain some small island of control in a world of chaos. Archer rarely talked about the war. When he did, he never mentioned the rituals. He would share safe memories, funny stories that didn't capture the real terror. The real story, the story of how he and millions of other men had survived psychologically by learning to laugh at death and creating private magical rituals, that story stayed mostly unspoken. It was a truth that could only be fully understood by men who had been there, who had lived in the mud and developed the same defenses. When Archer died, his wife found the pebble in his jacket pocket. Smooth, worn, unremarkable. She had no idea why her husband had carried the same stone for 50 years. She almost threw it away, but something made her keep it. Maybe some dim recognition that whatever that pebble represented, it had been important to the man she'd loved. She kept it in a drawer. And eventually she forgot about it. The pebble became just another forgotten object, its significance lost when the man who gave it meaning was gone. The British soldiers who fought in World War I faced psychological challenges unprecedented in human history. Industrial warfare created sustained, intense trauma on a scale that no previous generation had experienced. The human mind, evolved over millions of years to cope with the occasional dramatic threat, was simply not designed to handle months or years of continuous mortal danger. In response, soldiers developed their own informal psychological technologies. The dark humor that allowed them to laugh at death. The rituals and superstitions that provided a sense of control. The group cohesion that came from shared suffering and shared coping mechanisms. These weren't taught by military authorities or prescribed by physicians. They emerged organically from the conditions of trench warfare itself. These coping mechanisms worked imperfectly but effectively. They allowed men to maintain psychological function far longer than should have been possible. They prevented the universal psychological collapse that some military planners had feared. But they also had limitations and cost. The humor that helped in combat could become alienating in peacetime. The rituals that provided stability in chaos could become compulsive behaviors. And for many men, the coping mechanisms eventually failed entirely, leading to psychological breakdown. What we've learned from studying these World War I survivors has implications far beyond military history. The ways humans respond to extreme sustained stress, the informal psychological defenses we develop, the social and individual rituals we create to manage fear and uncertainty, these are fundamental aspects of human psychology that emerge in any sufficiently stressful situation. The dark humor of soldiers in World War I wasn't unique to that conflict or even to military contexts. Similar humor appears in emergency rooms, among firefighters in disaster zones, anywhere humans face regular exposure to death and trauma. The rituals and superstitions weren't irrational quirks but adaptive responses to environments of radical uncertainty. And the struggle to readjust when the acute stress ends is a challenge not just for veterans but for anyone who has lived through prolonged crisis. The story of how British soldiers coped with trauma during World War I is ultimately a story about human resilience and its limits. It shows us both how remarkably adaptable humans can be, developing new psychological tools to survive situations that should be unsurvivable, and how finite that adaptability is, how even the strongest defenses can eventually fail. The men who fought in the trenches, who learned to laugh at death and touch lucky charms and maintain small rituals as barriers against chaos, they taught us something profound about the human mind. They showed us that psychological survival requires more than just physical courage. It requires humor, even if that humor is dark and disturbing. It requires ritual, even if those rituals seem irrational. It requires social connection, even if that connection is forged in the worst possible circumstances. And they showed us that trauma doesn't simply disappear when the danger ends. The psychological tools that allowed them to survive combat stayed with them for decades afterward. The humor remained. The rituals remained. The hypervigilance remained. The nightmares remained. The war ended, but its psychological legacy continued, carried forward by men who had learned to cope with the unendurable and then had to figure out how to live with what that coping had cost them. Every veteran who came home from the Western Front carried invisible burdens. Some carried them quietly, performing their private rituals in corners where no one would notice. Some carried them conspicuously, their dark humor and strange habits marking them as different, as changed. Some were crushed by the weight and never fully recovered. But they all carried something. They carried memories that couldn't be shared with people who hadn't been there. They carried humor that didn't translate to civilian life. They carried rituals that only made sense in the context of constant mortal threat. They carried psychological wounds that had no visible scars but never fully healed. And we carry their legacy. The understanding they forced us to develop about trauma, about coping, about the limits of human psychological endurance. The recognition that humor and ritual aren't just cultural ornaments but survival tools. The knowledge that psychological injury is as real and as deserving of respect as physical injury. The British soldiers who learned to laugh at death in the trenches of France and Belgium, who touched lucky charms and followed superstitious routines and sang bitter songs about their own mortality, they were doing something profoundly human. They were finding ways to remain themselves in circumstances designed to destroy humanity. They were using whatever psychological tools they could create to protect their minds the way their steel helmets protected their heads. Those tools weren't perfect. They weren't sufficient. But they were what these men had, and for many of them they were enough to survive. To come home. To have lives, even if those lives were marked by scars no one could see. The pebbles in their pockets, the jokes that made civilians uncomfortable, the rituals they couldn't explain even to themselves, these were the price and the proof of their survival. The things they carried home from the war. The things that carried them through it. And in the end, perhaps that's all anyone can do when faced with the unendurable. Find something to hold on to, something to laugh about, something to believe in. Touch your lucky charm. Tell your dark joke. Follow your ritual. And hope it's enough to see you through to the other side. Where you'll carry those habits forever, a permanent reminder of what you survived and what it cost to survive it.